Greetings, Acolytes. Welcome back to the channel. We're here with another discussion video. Let's go ahead and get into why the Acolyte does not understand the philosophy of lightsaber combat. Of course, I'm again joined with the Archivist. Always a pleasure, my friend.
Hey, it's always a pleasure to be here.
So, one of the major issues in the Acolyte, one of the major issues, at least for me, is how they approach fundamentally what it means to be a Jedi and what it means to wield a lightsaber. So what do we mean by that? In the Acolyte, in more than one occasion, we see that the Jedi are extremely slow to draw upon their lightsaber, and that when they do that, they essentially have deemed their enemy worthy of death. It is a last resort to the Jedi, and because of that, when their enemies are unarmed in the Acolyte, the Jedi refuse to act. They refuse to attack in any way. They refuse to kill an enemy no matter how dangerous. Obviously, the big one being prospective Sith and Chimere. But also in the very first episode with May and Master Indara, they have some dialogue back and forth about what it means when a Jedi actually draws upon their lightsaber and that the enemy has to be armed and dangerous at the time. Now, while that's all fine, it's also severely contradicting the pre-existing lore, which is par for the course for the Acolyte at this point, so no surprise. But nonetheless, we figured we would sit down, and instead of just saying that this contradicts the lore and how Jedi approach using their lightsaber on individuals, be that enemies, armed or unarmed, we wanted to back that up and not just say, well, it doesn't understand lightsabers. What specifically do the writers of the Acolyte not understand about lightsabers and lightsaber combat? So first, interestingly enough, I thought it appropriate to draw upon a canon source, and that is Obi-Wan Kenobi in a comic explaining to a young Anakin Skywalker what a lightsaber is, what it really represents. Obviously, he has the famous line in Attack of the Clones that the lightsaber is Anakin's life. But how does Obi-Wan explain to a young Anakin the importance of using a lightsaber? He doesn't say to him, you only draw your lightsaber when you're prepared or ready to kill. Obi-Wan says this: a lightsaber is a reminder that while we can do more, we very purposefully do not. It's a symbol of restraint when a Jedi uses a weapon that can kill so easily, yet they use it non-lethally. So, what are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on Obi-Wan Kenobi's approach to a lightsaber and how that differs from what we're seeing in the Acolyte?
Man, I mean, I knew something was wrong the minute they talked about a Jedi doesn't draw their lightsaber unless prepared to kill. I was like, you know, let's go ahead and put aside all of the practical reasons why that's false. All the times that Jedi have cut through doors or even used their lightsabers as a light source when going through a cave. Let's like put aside all of those uses for just a moment.
Real quick, adding to another one of my favorite uses, though, before, sorry to cut you off, but one of my favorite uses is that Luke Skywalker on more than one occasion has turned on a lightsaber just to admire the craftsmanship of the tool. He does that with his father's lightsaber in A New Hope, which Obi-Wan Kenobi actively encourages. He gives him the lightsaber. He compels Luke to train with the lightsaber, but he also does it much later when Luke is a Jedi Knight when speaking with Grogu. Two canon examples with Yoda's lightsaber. He turns on Yoda's lightsaber and he's admiring the emerald blade and the meticulous crafting that went into creating essentially a representation of the Jedi's duty and their life. Now, Luke is just activating it simply to look at it. There's no great function. He's not trying to even cut open a door. He's not deflecting blaster bolts, and he's certainly not ready to kill Grogu when he turns it on, which the Acolyte Jedi might have freaked out if Luke had done that. They're like, Luke's about to kill this little creature. But I digress. Jedi before have used their lightsabers for reasons that are non-lethal, and it's never the lethality of a lightsaber, while important, is not the most important aspect of it. The fact is that it's such a lethal weapon, and yet the Jedi wield it with grace and compassion and understanding, something that may seem like an oxymoron, but the Jedi have elevated themselves and hold themselves to such a standard that they have this weapon that can inflict such pain and terror on people, and yet they use it very sparingly and with a lot of respect and understanding. So,
yeah, it's a controlled weapon. That's why it's called a Jedi's weapon. You know, it's like it is a weapon which is a hot sword, and it's one of those things where, you know, the reason in Kenobi's speech, like that quote you pulled, that was the very final thing he said after a long speech, because the context of that comic was Anakin asking Obi-Wan why they didn't use kyber technology to create more advanced weapons. And, you know, Obi-Wan, you know, gently tells him that he had an idea for something that was essentially lightsaber nunchucks one time, and he told, you know, Qui-Gon about it, but Qui-Gon gave him this speech, which he then gave to Anakin, which was that, you know, Jedi could use kyber technology for weapons of mass destruction, kill people from far away, but a sword is something that purposefully limits them against blaster-wielding opponents. And yet, whenever a lightsaber is ignited, that person is the most powerful being, you know, standing there. And it's that idea that a Jedi's weapon can kill in an instant, but they don't. They don't, because they have the control to be able to, you know, put someone down with it and still keep them alive, because the wounds, they cauterize immediately. Like, there's no bleeding, except for that one time in A New Hope. But that was before the whole mythos hit its stride.
So with that, what is Jedi training when it comes to learning how to use a lightsaber non-lethally? In the notes that you sent, the 9 contact points of a Jedi lightsaber combat style. What are those? What are the contact points, and what is the purpose for them?
Right, so we won't go over all the contact points because that would just, you know, be a lot. But what I would love to point out is in Jedi training, there are 9 contact points on a standard humanoid's body. And 5 of them, that's over half, are focused solely on disarmament and non-lethal takedowns. So you have the preferred method, which is the Sun Gem. This is what cuts the enemy's weapon in half. We see Dooku perform this on Anakin on Geonosis when he takes his lightsaber out of his left hand. Excuse me. Then we have the Shim. I think that's what it's called. It cuts the weapon hand, so that's like right in the palm, either grazing that or severing the fingers. And that's, you know, very controlled, very precise. But if you're not as controlled as to perform a shim, or the situation just doesn't call for it, you've got the Cho Mai, which we see a lot, which is what cuts the hand at the wrist. Basically Luke's injury.
Yeah, Vader executed that in an attempt to take Luke in non-lethally. A Sith Lord. There's an example of a Sith Lord using a lightsaber non-lethally.
Yeah, you gotta love that. You gotta love that he actually uses a Jedi technique to take his son to the Emperor, you know? And then you've got the Chomak, which is, it cuts the arm below the elbow, so the forearm, and I think, yeah, that's what Dooku does to Anakin on Geonosis. That's his, like, final blow.
And you were saying the other day that the Chomak is a technique pulled off by maybe less skilled duelists, and that cutting off someone's arm at the forearm is not always desirable for a Jedi, but that it's an option there for Jedi that maybe lack the technique of a more precise blow at the fingers or the wrist.
That is true. It's either the Chomak, but that one's still controlled because it's below the elbow. The one that you see less experienced Jedi and Force users pull off would be our final one, which is the Chosun. And that one is cutting the arm above the elbow, which is around the bicep or the shoulder. So, you know, it's one of those things where Anakin kind of left himself wide open in the Geonosis battle, and Dooku, you know, he did that like spinning cut. So it was a little less precise, but it still got the job done, and it was still below the elbow. So that's kind of one of those things that, like, in the heat of battle, it's easy to kind of lose your precision for even just a moment. But of course, Dooku, being as expert as he was, I'm sure he knew exactly what he was doing when he took.
Yeah, I think he wanted to inflict a little bit more pain on Anakin than would be common for a Jedi, would be my interpretation.
I would say so, absolutely. But
it's compelling that they have these forms and that they specifically go out of their way to avoid cutting someone's arm off at the bicep or shoulder so that they can have a very, as an enabled life as they can after the fact as possible. And that's something that we're going to get into in just a sec here with Luke and his approach to lightsaber combat and how he's all for maiming. But it's interesting that the Jedi go out of their way to first start with removing their enemy's fingers. If that's not an option, the palm, the wrist, and then below the elbow. And then if you absolutely have to, above, around the bicep and the shoulder area. But there are levels to this, which is so compelling that the Jedi are for drawing their lightsaber, but ending the engagement as quickly as possible through maiming an enemy. Typically when the enemy's intention is to kill.
Every lightsaber drawing is supposed to be a last resort, as we know, but that doesn't mean that that resort is execution. Like, the first time we ever even see, you brought this up actually when we were talking about this yesterday, the first time we ever see a lightsaber in A New Hope is Ben Kenobi performing a Chosun on Dr. Evazan in the Mos Eisley Cantina. Cuts his arm off at the shoulder.
Excluding, I think, Luke looking at his lightsaber may come first, but this is the first actual use of a lightsaber. Mm-hmm. Which is so compelling that that's the first example in all of the lore in all of Star Wars. Again, this is A New Hope, the first act of A New Hope. Obi-Wan Kenobi draws upon his lightsaber and he cuts the arm off of the bar patron who's harassing Luke, and he does so non-lethally, and yet he still pulls upon his lightsaber. Now, the thing that the Acolyte gets right is that a Jedi should take their lightsaber and activate it as a last resort, but the egregious mistake that they make is implying that when a Jedi activates their lightsaber, that the sole intention is to kill. When that has never been the precedence ever set in the lore, canon and legends. I know a lot of people, a typical criticism levied is, well, you're just going solely off of legends lore. Well, actually with this, there's precedence both in canon pre-established and legends that both outright contradict a Jedi's use of the lightsaber. And the reason that this is important in the Acolyte is this is something that happens with Master Soul when Kymir says he shouldn't strike down an unarmed enemy. But it also happens earlier with Indara, which leads us to believe that this is the precedence that is set in this era for the Jedi, is don't pull out your lightsaber unless you intend to kill. We even see this with Jackie as she fights May. Jackie doesn't activate her lightsaber until the stranger appears. But clearly, maybe everything could have turned out different if Jackie had just cut off one of May's arms and then taken her prisoner that way. Or
at the very least, Luke, he says this a lot, it's the threat of the lightsaber which has the most power, and the moment you ignite it, you lose all of that ground, because then it's kind of like you're either expected to do something if the intimidation of it doesn't fails. With Jackie, she wouldn't have even had to touch May with the lightsaber. She could have just ignited it and leveled it at her throat and been like, you're under arrest, and that would have been it.
Yeah. So, mentioning Luke, and I just want to say in Legends continuity and in all of the lore, I think Luke gets it the most correct of any Jedi, which is par for the course for Grandmaster Luke. But Luke's approach to a Jedi and how they wield a lightsaber, I think, is absolutely perfect. What was his philosophy?
Luke, like I said just a second ago, was always about the threat, because he was under the impression that, look, the galaxy knows who we are now that we've reintroduced ourselves into the cultural zeitgeist. They know what we're about. They know what we're capable of. Just having the lightsaber presented on your belt is that badge of authority. And your voice should be the only weapon that you need. But if it comes to it and you have to lose all of your ground and ignite your lightsaber, then be prepared to do what you have to do. But he never said that that would mean killing, the perpetrator. Grandmaster Luke maintained that you listen to the Force and it informs a Jedi of exactly how much Force they're supposed to respond to when a danger presents itself. And the most beautiful example of this is actually in the Fate of the Jedi series, which is pretty apropos. I know this is off topic, but that's all centers around Abeloth, which is starting to become something that's circulating in canon. So that's kind of a cool thing to bring up. But he gets called into the office because the chief of state, a former Imperial named Natasi Dala, she's basically trying to get him to take responsibility for the fact that his Jedi don't follow proper government protocol. And so she gives him this hypothetical example and is like, let's say 2 Jedi are in a bar. One patron decides they don't like the look of another, blah, blah, blah. Blasters are drawn. The Jedi whip out their lightsabers, slice off the arms of the perpetrators. And then, the government officials come, they try to get some answers from the Jedi gives a cursory statement and then flits away to a next adventure. And Luke's like, cool, I don't really see a problem with that. And she's like, you don't. And he's like, no. And the reason I know is because in your situation, the Jedi responded appropriately to the level of danger that the Force would have informed them about. And, he talks, and so they kind of go back and forth on this subject about how is maiming a good or bad thing. And, she was like, why didn't they just use the Force? And he's like, they could have, but the Force did inform them that it was pertinent that they do maim the perpetrators. And it's like, his whole thing was, he even uses himself as an example, holding up his cybernetic arm. And he's like, look, cybernetics are so far advanced by this point that you can't even tell the difference between an organic hand and a cybernetic hand, besides the upkeep that they may need. And of course, they kind of go back and forth about that, but the whole, to the point where Luke even got annoyed. And he's like, so what's the problem? Are Jedi just hacking limbs off too frequently for the government's, quota or something? But that was his whole stance on it, is that he was like, to say, and to kind of bring that back around to what we're talking about, to say that the Jedi can't draw their lightsabers without killing is to fundamentally deny their ability to listen to the Force, which in the High Republic era, this is an era where we have been told the Jedi have it right. So if they're not listening to the Force when they draw their lightsabers, how can they be these perfect Jedi that we're told they're supposed to be? How can they be a Jedi at all?
Because they're poorly written.
Yeah.
The Acolyte Jedi would have just murdered those 2 bar patrons.
Apparently.
Probably not. They probably would have passively sat by, refused to draw the weapon, and they would have murdered each other, is the more realistic option. But again, when a Jedi approaches a situation, they are so much more massively powerful than 99.9% of the people involved. And because of that, they have to acutely listen to the Force to determine what measure of violent action they can even take. That's how powerful the Jedi are. But you raised the excellent point that if a Jedi pulls out their lightsaber with the intention to kill, they are no longer listening to the Force. They have superseded their own dogma and their own rules. And then when a lightsaber is drawn, it means death. But as you also pointed out, we're supposed to be in an era where the Jedi are far less dogmatic. And it would make more sense for the Clone Wars Jedi to have the precedence of you draw upon your lightsaber, that means death, rather than this era of Jedi that supposedly has things correct. It just makes no sense. By the Jedi saying, my lightsaber is only a weapon of death, they diminish the true importance of the lightsaber. And if the writers think that all lightsabers represent death rather than restraint and harmony through justice, then they just don't understand lightsabers and they don't understand the Jedi.
No, a lightsaber to a Jedi is a sword used as a shield, right? It's like, it's not this situation where it's like a samurai mythos, where it's like, you know, once you draw your blade, it has to taste blood before it can return to its scabbard. Like, the Jedi aren't like that. They're not supposed to inflict martial law every single time they take out their lightsaber.
Yeah. And again, the final point that I want to knock home is that Master Soul was not wrong for nearly killing Chimere, someone who said that they were like a Sith. And the Sith are the biggest problem in the galaxy for thousands of years at this point. They're absolutely terrible. They've been the bane of the Jedi's existence. They've killed millions, and all they seek is personal gratification and power. And that makes them extremely dangerous. Their Sith Lord's lightsaber is in many aspects the least useful weapon in the Dark Lord's arsenal. Their gifts of the Force in the dark side, their machinations and being able to stir, you know, rebellion and disorder and being masters of manipulation, these are the true weapons of a Sith Lord. And beyond all of that, you have the dark side of the Force. And you have methods such as Force Choke, Force Lightning, Force Repulse, extremely powerful Force Pushes. The point I'm trying to get at is a Sith is very, very rarely unarmed. Chimere is clearly not unarmed, to the point where even though he doesn't possess the literal lightsaber, he is still able to get the better of the Jedi present because of his thinking like a dark side wielder. And some of my favorite examples of this are Mace Windu versus Sidious, where Sidious tries to use the same argument against Windu, that he's unarmed, but Windu deems him too dangerous to be left alive and therefore moves to kill him. But in that moment, Palpatine is still a viable offensive threat, despite the fact that he has been disarmed by Windu. In fact, it's Palpatine the one that actually kills Windu, using not his lightsaber, but Force Lightning, and then throwing Windu out of the window. You know, he's using the Force on him in an offensive, violent manner without his lightsaber. And an example of this that I like even more is Yoda and Sidious, where in the Revenge of the Sith novelization, quite famously, Palpatine becomes far more dangerous when he puts his lightsaber away, because he's just so much more gifted in the methods of the Force, and he's able to amplify in the area that he's more gifted at, using Force Lightning and, you know, telekinesis, throwing around the Senate pods. He becomes more of a threat when he puts his lightsaber away, which is just fascinating. And Yoda realizes this. And when Palpatine loses his lightsaber, Yoda presses the assault, because unlike these Jedi in the Acolyte, Yoda knows that this is a Sith Lord and that he is dangerous at all times. In many ways, I would even say, in defense of Anakin killing Dooku, that Dooku, despite his lack of hands at that point, would still be extremely dangerous. Now, Anakin should have taken him prisoner because, you know, he's clearly lost and Dooku is on his knees. But he's still a viable threat. The Sith have never been dangerous because of their lightsabers. That's the point I would bring home. It's a tool.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I don't think that there is any Jedi that wouldn't have just taken Chimere's head off in that moment. Yeah. Like the fact that he was stopped by someone, Osha, who was like, and that's a whole like different can of worms. You know, she literally saw him snap the neck of one of her Jedi friends. Like, you want to talk about an unarmed prisoner? He was unarmed right then, and an armed Jedi got his neck broken. Like, yeah, come on.
And now she's friends with Chimere.
Oh man. Oh, we can't wait for tomorrow's episode, right?
No, it's almost over. Anyway, the Acolyte does not understand lightsabers. They don't understand the importance and what they represent to the Jedi. And besides it just being incorrect in terms of what we've seen before in Star Wars, it's also incorrect when looking at the story that they're telling and the dangers that the Sith represent. A lot of the times in stories, the Jedi become far more vicious when the Sith arise. We were talking about this the other day, that when the Jedi see an individual with a red lightsaber, they're filled with a sense of fear, but also commitment to eliminating that threat, to making sure that the Sith don't rise to a great level of prominence like they had before. And that can lead Jedi down a darker path, but that's still what's set there, the precedence. And I think the reason why the Acolyte Jedi only draw upon their weapon when they're going to kill is an attempt to keep them from falling to the dark side. But there is just pure-hearted justice and the preservation of life. The Sith represent the destruction of life, and their own goals supersede everything else. It supersedes life. It supersedes politics. The Sith will do absolutely anything they can, and they will brutally murder and dispose of anybody that they can to further their own goals. And there's no one more intimately familiar with that than the Jedi Order. And because of that reason, Sith should be kill on sight, as they are in 99.9% of the lore.
Exactly. And I mean, I love what you brought up that one time where you were saying that, in Legends, the Sith rise, they fight the Jedi, they fall, and it just kind of cycles around that. But in canon, as far as we know, they are following George Lucas's original vision, which was at one point the Sith were the primary rulers of the galaxy, falling in line with what Sidious says in Revenge of the Sith, where he says, once more the Sith shall rule the galaxy, And we talked about how the Jedi rose up in response to this threat and decided to liberate the galaxy and the Republic, and that was 1,000 years prior to where we are now.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I wanted to sort of fill in the lore gaps for people that were asking. They were asking how we came to that conclusion. And the reason we got to that conclusion in canon, if you look at the canon timelines, is that the Sith held large portions of the known galaxy, including Coruscant, for what could presume to be around 100 years. And that is actually why there is a Sith shrine below the Jedi Temple on Coruscant. And it is only once the Jedi and the Republic formed that they were able to take back Coruscant from the Sith and establish their Jedi Temple on this capital world. So the Sith held Coruscant for a very long time. And with Coruscant, what we can assume to be, if not the capital world, but a major world in the politics of the galaxy at that time, the Sith have ruled. And that's sort of where we got that lore. The Sith had Coruscant for a very long time, and they controlled large swaths of the known galaxy, if not the entirety of it.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for filling that in. But kind of adding on to what your point was, is like, I love that you brought that up, because, even in Legends, a Sith would be kill on sight, especially because we don't want them rising up, causing yet another Jedi schism and another galactic war. But in canon, that, threat is turned up to 11, because it's like, these are the evil fascists that ruled the galaxy 1,000 years prior and made it a living hell for everyone. Like, that they need to be brought down. They cannot be allowed to let go. And so any red lightsaber, whether Dark Jedi or Sith, should be a kill on sight, because that threat level is just elevated that much more. Yeah.
And what's compelling is Luke is the most compassionate character when it comes to Sith in all of the lore. And eventually, his lesson that he is taught through Lumaya is that once someone becomes a Sith Lord and goes down that dark path, if they refuse to turn from that dark path, they have to be eliminated. And although Luke had problems with the way he went about executing Lumaya, it was still ultimately for the betterment of the galaxy in the end. And if Luke had probably not sensed any conflict with Vader, I also think he probably would have moved to take him out very solemnly. But again, Luke did sense conflict in Vader. That's what kept pushing him to make the decision to try and save his father. But even once Vader, with that conflict within him, even when Vader even when Luke could sense the conflict, the second that Vader threatened innocence in the form of the rebellion and in the form of his sister, Luke went in for the kill.
Yeah. And, it's like, you also want to talk about Darth Caedus. Luke absolved himself from going after Caedus even after he learned that he was the real murderer behind his wife and not Lumaya. But even afterwards, he showed restraint by saying, I'm not going to do it, but it still needs to be done. Someone still has to do it. I'm just not going to do it because I don't trust myself not to fall into vengeance. So it's like one of those things where he didn't take away the fact that Caedus still needed to be dealt with, and he realized that he was not coming back. Every one of the Skywalkers tried, and, it just wasn't in the books. And so it ended up falling to his twin sister, Jaina, unfortunately, to do the deed. But the deed was still done, is the point,
And the galaxy was liberated because the Sith are the bad guys.
Thank you.
That's just something that is seems to be... You can make characters complex and interesting, but don't portray this, the Sith as, virtuous. They all throw it away. Forever the Sith have thrown away virtue. And I'm not saying that they've done that with Chimere, but they've certainly attempted to humanize him and to make his turn understandable, which is okay, but there's a fine line that needs to be balanced there. And the Acolyte thus far has showed that they don't care about that line whatsoever.
The Sith are really cool because they're complex and yet incredibly straightforward. It's like the minute you feel compassionate to the plight of a Sith, alarm bells should be going off in your brain. That means you're being manipulated, right? Yeah. Because it's like the Joker, right, with Harley Quinn. If he starts talking, if a Sith starts talking to you, sweet talking, oh, I had a bad, childhood, my master did this and that to me, immediately he is manipulating you, and you will fall into the dark side due to his venom. And it's like, because the Sith feel no remorse. They may have had a terrible past, but they renounce that past as soon as they become a Darth.
And take a new name. They take a new name.
Exactly.
Don't forget what the Sith are. The Sith is a religion that is solely based around power and superiority through the use of the Force. The Sith are so corrupt, they refuse to even use the Force as it is intended. They believe that they are above it. They can bend it to their will and use it to accomplish their own goals, even if the Force itself resists them. They have dominion over it, not vice versa. Which, again, these are the bad guys. That's not right.
Yeah, but, so, bringing that around, if a Jedi sees a Sith because of all these things, heck yeah, they're going to whip it out and their lightsabers out and decapitate them. Yeah,
it'll be game over. That's pretty much all I have. I just think the Acolyte doesn't understand the philosophy behind a lightsaber and why Jedi use lightsabers, but it's
well said.
It's disappointing. That's all I have.
That's all I've got too.
Guys, thank you so much for listening to another discussion. We thought that this was a really important thing to highlight. A lot of people have highlighted it already, showing a lot of examples of people using lightsabers for means other than dealing out death. But we wanted to come on and illustrate that that is never the intention of a Jedi, and that it's not the intention of their weapon either, the lightsaber. That it's a sacred tool, and it should be used with great restraint, but also in the service of justice and a better galaxy. So, thank you. Thank you as always, my friends. Thank you again to the Archivist. Always a pleasure, my friend.
Hey, I'm so glad you have me on.
Leave your thoughts down below in the comments. What are your thoughts on lightsaber combat? What are your thoughts on the Jedi in the Acolyte wielding their lightsabers as it solely a weapon of death? Is this something that you find interesting? Is this something that will go later on in the lore and attempt to maybe even retcon why the Jedi are behaving this way? Or do you think that this is just an egregious break of not only the canon lore and Legends lore, but again, with it being canon, lore that Disney had a hand in crafting and, explaining to us through characters what lightsabers are supposed to represent? Obviously, the writers of The Acolyte didn't read that comic, so here we are. As always, my friends, thank you so much for watching and listening to another discussion. May the Force be with you, and we will see you guys tomorrow with our review for The Acolyte, Episode 7. Have a good one.
Can't wait for it.
Bye-bye.